Hi everyone. In this video I want to persuade you that when an economist says their analysis is more credible because they have a model on their side, they are usually wrong and should be ignored.
It's not that I'm better than this, it's just that I'm much cleverer than you need to be to work here.
I want to use the example of globalization and how economists have approached it to illustrate my point. It's no secret that the negative consequences of globalization have made themselves felt over the past few years, and that economists have at best committed a sin of omission by failing to notice them unfold. Globalization has been linked to economic decline in former manufacturing hubs.
Our town is dying. 1 out of every 4 homes is an abandoned, dilapidated structure, and you get told, keep picking up trash and let leaders do what leaders do.
Creating unemployment, deaths of despair, and political backlash. This is despite economists being consistent supporters of and even architects of trade deals. Surely there is no better person to use as a foil than Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, who probably has the biggest public reach of any economist today. Krugman won his Nobel for his work on trade, but before that he made his name as a public intellectual in the 1990s, responding to critics of globalization who were unhappy with economists cheerleading for free trade. He was dismissive of critics of globalization as unsophisticated, ideological, and ignorant. In fact, he was so insufferable that the New York Times eventually gave him a column. Centrist Twitter still salivates over his 1990s articles to this day.
Why are you the way that you are?
These debates are useful for us as they often dovetailed into discussions about economic theory. The critics were convinced that the unrealistic assumptions used in trade theory made it irrelevant, while Krugman defended them as a source of insights. Krugman frequently denied that globalization would have a major impact on wages and employment at home. His view is best summed up by the following quote from the man himself. At one point, a member of the audience asked me what I thought the effect of NAFTA would be on the number of jobs in the United States. When I replied none, based on the standard arguments, the trade official exploded in anger. It's remarks like that which explain why people hate economists. Yet Krugman has himself admitted he was wrong. In an article on Bloomberg a few months ago, and don't worry, I will link all of these sources in the bio, he said, globalization produced far more disruption and cost for some workers than the consensus had envisaged. The article is actually a limited admission of wrongness, and Krugman doesn't hesitate to take preemptive snipes at would-be critics like me, but we have to ask why he was even wronger than he thinks. And to do this, we need to learn and then unlearn some trade theory. Part 1. Economic Theories of Trade. International trade theory begins, and for some ends, with the 19th century economist David Ricardo's idea of comparative advantage. Krugman called it Ricardo's difficult idea and chided journalists and pundits for not understanding it. An example like this one is usually used to illustrate the principle. Here we have 2 countries, England and Portugal, who can produce 2 different goods, cloth and wine. With an hour of work, the UK can produce either 5 pieces of cloth or 10 bottles of wine. Portugal can produce 20 of either. Ricardo argued that although it appears Portugal is dominant in this situation, which might lead an unsophisticated observer to call for protectionism in the UK, both countries will benefit from specialising in their so-called comparative advantage, which just means using your own time most effectively to produce. Here the UK is better at producing wine than it is at producing cloth, so it should specialise in wine. Countries never have the same comparative advantage in these examples, so Portugal should produce cloth. By doing this, then trading, each country ends up with more in total than they could have produced alone. If the UK produces 10 bottles of wine while Portugal produces 20 pieces of cloth, the 2 countries can then trade 6 bottles of wine for 4 pieces of cloth. Now, after an hour of work, the UK has 4 of each, which would have taken them over an hour to produce. Portugal has 6 bottles of wine and 16 pieces of cloth, which would also have taken them over an hour to produce. Trade effectively acts as a cheat. Even if you are not the best at producing something, you can sneakily access another country's ability to produce it via the magic of trade. It doesn't take much to see that this example is hugely oversimplified. One key assumption of comparative advantage, as well as the more advanced Heckscher-Ohlin model, is that countries have a kind of innate propensity to produce particular goods, which doesn't change with trade policy. When applied to the real world, this amounts to saying that Germans just have some innate ability or resource that makes them good at producing cars, or that Japanese people have an innate knack for producing video games.
The Japanese? Those sandal-wearing goldfish tenders?
In fact, it turns out comparative advantage isn't so good at explaining trade. I'll let some guy explain why.
Economists have talked about international trade for a couple of centuries, and for about 180 of those 200 years, there was a basic view, which was that countries trade because they're different. This country's tropical, so it exports bananas. This country's got lots of land, so it exports wheat. And there was this kind of building discontent because a lot of world trade is between countries that don't look very different.
Krugman's work on theories of trade addressed at least some of these concerns and is the reason he won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. Countries specialise because they face increasing returns. The more they produce in a given industry, the lower the costs. And as certain countries become established in certain industries, others are unable to enter the market and compete. As a result, different countries specialise in different industries, so they will benefit from trading with each other. Many of these theories anticipate the problems we've seen in the real world, with trade creating winners and losers in terms of income, even if overall income increases. But Krugman recently admitted that even these improved models didn't turn much to analytic methods that focus on workers in particular industries and communities, which would have given a better picture of short-run trends. This was, I now believe, a major mistake, one in which I shared a hand. If you read his papers, you will see that they routinely assume full employment, and it's kind of hard to talk about unemployment when you assume that it doesn't exist. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details of the theories, because they are mathematically complicated, but in case you do, I have linked Krugman's papers along with an excellent short explainer by Jonathan Catalan in the bio. What I want to ask is the following. With Krugman's admission that despite all these supposedly sophisticated developments in economic theory, economists like him still underplayed the downsides of trade, what was the point in using theory to analyse trade? Why was he so sure of his models in the 1990s, including comparative advantage, when refuting critics of globalisation? Part 2. Here's your theory, Mr. Burns. Paul Krugman is not stupid. In fact, he has anticipated my objection by several decades, using a very clever argument. One of Krugman's most relevant articles from the 90s is entitled The Fall and Rise of Development Economics, which is what I will focus on in this part of the video. Krugman discusses the evolution of economic theory as a process of first building overly simplified models, only to bring realism back in as techniques develop. Although there'll be a short-term loss of knowledge, the endpoint will be a fuller understanding, or so his argument goes. He compares this process to 15th century maps of Africa, which in many ways were inferior to the non-scientific understanding the local populations had before. Over time, though, cartography gave us modern maps, which are superior to pre-scientific understanding in many respects. Once again, a key part of this debate was increasing returns to production, which was not originally feasible because the maths just didn't work out. Instead, theorists had to assume costs rose with output, an unrealistic assumption which a tutor of mine once said amounts to stating that at some point in their expansion, businesses just become incompetent. This assumption put the models at odds with theories of development that held the state should kickstart industry because these relied on industry benefiting from economies of scale, growing in competitiveness until the government could step aside. Krugman argues that the mathematical models with increasing returns which were eventually developed by economists were worth the wait. Let's back up to summarise the debate so far. Number 1. Early critics of globalisation warned that it would hollow out manufacturing hubs and lead to unemployment, social dislocation and political backlash. 2. Economists said no, often using simple models like comparative advantage, which completely ignored this problem. 3. More advanced models paid more attention to the problem but still underestimated it, as admitted by Krugman. 4. Eventually the predicted backlash took place. Economists admitted they had been wrong to dismiss the critics, and are now recognising it as a problem. All in all, this is starting to feel a bit like...
I need to send this parcel with the profit projections to Pete Porter in Pasadena. And it absolutely, positively has to be there overnight.
Pete Porter, pass it on.
Pasadena, promptly.
Package parcel processing, pronto.
For Pete Porter in Pasadena.
Priority.
Precisely.
Here's your package, Mr. Burns. My name is the return address, you senseless dunderpate.
Unlike 15th century maps, or Krugman's other example of meteorology, the more advanced versions of economic theory do not seem to say much more than the informal theories they replaced, and perhaps even say less. Krugman argues that we had no way to know that the hyperglobalization that began in the 1990s would happen, but this is false. A book Krugman called Thoroughly Silly in the 1990s predicted globalization would leave some sectors of Americans triumphant and other sectors devastated. Towards the end of The Fall and Rise of Development Economics, Krugman gives a list of reasons that models lead to greater clarity than the informal theories they replaced. Instead of painstakingly going through them one by one and responding, I'll just state my view on the matter and leave you to come to your own conclusions, including how my view relates to his, should you care to read his essay, which I do of course recommend. The problem is that economists tend to believe there is some intrinsic benefit to putting ideas into mathematical models. They are their own justification. In a 1979 paper, Krugman outright stated that he was simply creating a model for ideas which have been in the air for some time. But how much work is the model doing when it's telling us something we already knew? Whatever mechanisms and variables are most important for proving these ideas mathematically are only relevant if you assume the model itself is. Even worse, it's not clear economists are really willing to follow models to their logical conclusions when they don't like these conclusions. In a 1997 article, Krugman proclaimed, if there were an economist creed, it would surely contain the affirmations, I understand the principle of comparative advantage and I advocate free trade. He goes on to defend free trade in spite of his own models. At one point he states, free trade can serve as a focal point on which countries can agree to avoid trade wars. It can also serve as a simple principle with which to resist pressures of special interest politics. Now I have some sympathy for this statement. It's sensible. The problem is that it has nothing to do with trade models at the time, and once you open up the possibility of using ad hoc, subjective reasons like this to reject models, it's not clear where you draw the line. I could equally invoke reasons of unemployment and community to defend protectionism, and they're not in the models either. Or I could invoke political economy against free trade deals. Dean Baker has a lot of excellent work on how, through patent laws, trade deals are rigged to favour the wealthy. Danny Roderick has discussed how stronger protections against the downsides of trade can actually increase political support for globalization over the long term. I would prefer a discourse which wrestled with these different ideas in their own right, instead of waylaying and misdirecting understanding for decades and even centuries. As a final point, I want to say that this is not a screed against models altogether. My rule is that if you want to illustrate a principle, keep a model simple. If you want to make it more complex, then you need to show it's worth it. This is why, despite everything, I actually prefer comparative advantage to Krugman's more complex trade theories, and that's why I spent some time explaining it to you. It's a neat way to illustrate the gains from specialization in trade, and it's so obviously unrealistic that, as long as it's taught properly, it would never be taken too literally. And there is almost never a case for disregarding historical or qualitative analysis over models of any kind. Thanks for watching this video. Please like and subscribe for more videos about economics. If you have any thoughts on how to manage globalization or the uses and abuses of economic theory, I'd love to hear them.